Can Guantanamo Bay be closed on time? A report ordered by Obama on a review of detention and interrogation at the jail delayed. Is the US president backtracking on his pledges to shut down the infamous jail? Or is it just a matter of legal and political obstacles that take time to overcome? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Al-Barra. A final report ordered by the US president on the future of Guantanamo Bay detainees has been delayed for 6 months. Soon after taking office, President Barack Obama signed an order to close the prison by January 2010 and set up a task force to come up with recommendations. Along with the recent delay announcement came a preliminary report by the task force. The report, true to Obama's prior pledges, envisions a three-tiered system of justice for dealing with alleged terrorists. First, trials before ordinary courts for some. Second, military commissions for others. And thirdly, indefinite detention with no charges for the rest, which represents the biggest challenge. The preliminary report has been criticized as being the first step in laying the foundation stone for the Obama justice system, which basically includes a new scheme of preventive detention plus his version of military commissions. Let's look back at how and when the Guantanamo Bay camp came about. The camp was set up by the Bush administration in January 2002 for so-called unlawful enemy combatants from its war on Afghanistan. At one point, it held 779 detainees from 49 countries. Most were released or transferred under the Bush administration. 242 inmates remained when Barack Obama took office. But 6 months on, just 12 have been transferred, with 229 still at Guantanamo. One detainee committed suicide last month. Well, joining us today are our guests in Washington, D.C., Niall Gardiner, director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. In London, Andy Worthington, journalist and author of the Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison. The first book to tell the story of every prisoner at Guantanamo. And in Doha, Corey Crider, a staff attorney with Reprieve. She helps represent over 40 current and former Guantanamo prisoners. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by asking Mr. Gardiner in Washington, D.C. By pushing back the self-imposed deadline, is Obama genuinely committed to shutting down Guantanamo, or is he more softening his promises?
I think this is clear evidence that Barack Obama is backtracking on his pledge to close down Guantanamo. I think he increasingly understands that the closure of this facility is extremely difficult for the United States, and he is encountering not only tremendous public opposition, but also strong opposition on Capitol Hill. Even leading Democrats, Harry Reid, for example, Senator James Webb, have opposed key aspects of Obama's Guantanamo closure plan. Public opinion polls indicate that the vast majority of Americans are opposed to the closure of this facility. Even among Democrats, there is very strong opposition. So Obama sees the way in which the public mood is moving. Congress has opposed additional funding for the closure of Guantanamo. We are seeing, I think, this administration reversing course. Right.
Andy, do you subscribe to what has been said by Gardiner, the fact that Obama is facing mounting pressure in the US and therefore he has to review what has been pledged in the past?
Well, not entirely. I mean, I wouldn't say, for starters, I think it's important to say that it's not a vast majority of the American people that resisted to the idea of Guantanamo being closed. I think maybe a small majority. Also, I think that the Democrats in particular will change their position on Guantanamo when they're presented with a fixed plan. I have no doubt that Barack Obama meant what he said when he wanted to close the prison within a year. It doesn't mean releasing everybody or sorting out trials. What it means is closing the prison in Guantanamo and arranging for prisoners who are not released to be moved to another facility. And that, I'm sure, is what he'll be working on with a firm plan for Congress.
Right. Kramer, where everybody was talking about political consideration, and as you know, Cheney who has been cheerleading the efforts during the last few months, has been saying basically that Obama is trying, by closing Guantanamo, he will definitely undermine the security of the United States of America. Do you think that the Republican strategy paid off?
I think it's an interesting question. A lot of the discussion we're having has to do with personality politics. Is Obama going back on his promise? Is Cheney convincing everyone that he's making a mistake? And I think that's an error in focus. I think that instead of talking about the personalities at the top, such as Obama, we should be thinking more about the human faces and the human stories at the bottom. I think that would make both the United States government and the U.S. people able to make much more intelligent decisions about who should be released and who shouldn't, rather than talking about these issues in the abstract. Yes, Obama, I think, is well-meaning, fully intends to close Guantanamo, but it's not as if every person on the ship of state changed when he took office in January 2009. A lot of the people still there were the very same people who built Guantanamo Bay and formulated the harmful policies in the first place. I think we would get a lot farther in talking about these issues if we talked about some of the real human beings, because although, yes, maybe there are some hard cases left in Guantanamo, there are also some entirely resolvable issues.
Before going into detail about the review of the interrogation and the detention, let's see whether Obama has changed his stance. President Obama sounded really optimistic back in January when he signed the executive order.
By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, in order to effect the appropriate disposition of individuals currently detained by the Department of Defense at Guantanamo, and promptly to close the detention facility at Guantanamo consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and the interests of justice, I hereby order. And we then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now.
Then there was a change of tone in Obama's approach. This is what he had to say more recently when he became involved in the real situation.
I knew when I ordered Guantanamo closed that it would be difficult and complex. There are 240 people there who have now spent years in legal limbo. In dealing with the situation, we don't have the luxury of starting from scratch. We're cleaning up something that is quite simply a mess. A misguided experiment that has left in its wake a flood of legal challenges that my administration is forced to deal with on a constant, almost daily basis, and that consumes the time of government officials whose time should be spent on better protecting our country.
Mr. Gardiner, the decision to shut down Guantanamo was seen more of a symbol of a change in the new administration, because Guantanamo has been seen by many as the symbol of the harsh treatment of Muslim detainees in Guantanamo. Do you think that Obama has realized now that this is a more complex reality, that he has to be very cautious when it comes to taking a final decision?
Well, I think that he has realized that this is a highly complex situation. I think he's also gaining understanding, actually, that Guantanamo actually worked. This was a facility that or a facility that continues to keep in check extremely dangerous individuals. And one of the key reasons why the United States has avoided being attacked since 9/11 has been the success of the Guantanamo detention facility. And
well, this is something that, for example, Dick Cheney has been saying in the past. Since 9/11, nothing has happened wrong on our watch.
Well, I think Dick Cheney is absolutely correct, and frankly, a large number of Americans would agree with Dick Cheney's assessment. And it's interesting to note, of course, that the Obama administration is now adopting many of the key aspects of the Bush administration's war on terror, including, for example, the implementation of military tribunals for some of the Guantanamo detainees. They've kept most of the key aspects of the Patriot Act, for example. They may well keep some aspects of the interrogation techniques used by the CIA. I think that this administration is realizing that the Bush administration's strategy for defeating Islamist terrorism is actually working.
All right, Mr. Worthington, what do you make of this? I mean, what Guardian has been saying just now, that closing Guantanamo will further make the United States of America more vulnerable to attacks.
Well, you know, I think that's nonsense, and I don't think there's any proof that randomly rounding up and imprisoning nearly 800 men in Guantanamo has kept anybody safe. I think it's actually made the United States more of a target, and that's not the reason that it hasn't been attacked. The problem with all these arguments about the dangerousness of the prisoners, which is the kind of thing that Dick Cheney and his advocates come up with, is that this has never been demonstrated in any manner. The men held in imprisonment should be held because they're prisoners of war who are screened to find out whether they actually are combatants or not, or should be held as criminal suspects. And neither happened in the case of what the Bush administration did. Now, we know that 85% on average of the prisoners were bought at a time when bounty payments were being paid for al-Qaeda and Taliban suspects. We know that they've never adequately been screened to ascertain whether they actually are dangerous, which is the reason that the Supreme Court gave them habeas corpus rights. They wouldn't do this normally for prisoners seized in wartime. They understood that the government had made no legitimate claims whatsoever about who these men were. So, you know, this is going off on a wild goose chase. And what disappoints me about what the president's doing is that he doesn't have the courage to say, essentially, there are a small number of people that we regard as dangerous. These people should be put forward for federal court trials. There's no way that an American jury isn't going to convict somebody when proof can be made of some connection to terrorism. And the rest of the men, well, you know, they should be released because they have no connection with terrorism.
We'll definitely
and
come
this
back.
has been demonstrated over the years.
And we'll talk in detail about the technicalities of the detentions. Corey Crider, do you think that the delay was sparked by a sense of fear or concern among the administration that this could further expose the cases of waterboarding, torture, or unveil what has been kept secret so far?
I think secrecy is an ongoing issue, but I think when you raise fear, actually, I think the hesitation had to do with fear-mongering by right-wingers who said that everyone in Guantanamo was a dangerous terrorist. But let's look at some of the actual human beings who've come out of Guantanamo in the past several months. You have Mohammed El-Ghorani, our client, a kid who was taken to Guantanamo at 14 years of age, found innocent in a federal court, and is now home with his family in Chad. The so-called intelligence said that he was a member of a London cell of al-Qaeda in 1998 when Mohammed was 11 years old and had never left his family home in Medina, Saudi Arabia. We also know about the 4 poor Uyghurs who were recently sent to Bermuda after Republicans successfully blocked sending those guys to the United States. Even the Bush administration conceded that those 4 individuals, and in fact all of the Uyghurs ever held in Guantanamo, never took up arms against the United States and were no kind of a threat to anyone. But in a kind of typical not in my backyard syndrome, right-wingers, when they heard that Uyghurs might resettle in the U.S. as refugees, came out in droves saying these guys are terrorists and so forth, and therefore they had to go to Bermuda. And it's that kind of not in my backyard activity, that kind of sentiment, I think, that's really started to slow down the closure of the prison.
The issue of what to do with the current inmates has been frequently cited as a major stumbling block before the camp can be closed. As we said, 229 inmates remain in Guantanamo. 50 have already been cleared for release, but the US fears they could be mistreated if they return to their home countries, as many have poor human rights records. Several European Union countries have agreed to step in to help accommodate these people, but such relocation is still a headache for the US administration. Earlier this year, it emerged that former Saudi detainees had joined al-Qaeda in Yemen, where the group continues to be very active. There are rehabilitation programs for radicalized people. However, after their release, the men had been part of a program in Saudi Arabia, but still returned to jihad. Those not cleared for repatriation will face prosecution and will likely be transferred to military prisons in America. This too is likely to cause local opposition at the thought of terror suspects being held on US soil. Niall Gardiner, Washington, D.C., and Andy Worthington, London. Corey Crider, you're joining us to talk about the delay of the report on detention and interrogation in Guantanamo. Mr. Gardiner, now the Obama administration is talking about the legal issues and the legal considerations. Do you think that the military court is something that definitely has to emerge as one of the top problems facing the Obama administration?
I think so, but I would like to just address, firstly, a couple of the comments earlier by your other guests. The notion that the majority of the Guantanamo detainees are innocent figures who pose no danger is absolutely ludicrous. And even the Obama administration acknowledges that a large number of these detainees are extremely dangerous. European Union countries are taking about a grand total of 10 detainees so far, because they argue that many of them are extremely dangerous individuals. According to Pentagon figures, dozens of those released from Guantanamo so far have returned to the battlefield and are taking part in terrorist activities.
Again, it's very surprising, Mr. Gardiner, to see that...
That's a very important point.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? The US administration is willing to transfer some of these people to Europe when the Congress is banning the US to resettle them in the United States of America. Isn't this a clear example of double standard? What is safe for Europe is not safe for the United States of America.
You know, frankly, I mean, the European Union has been campaigning for years to close down Guantanamo, but now we see the majority of European countries refusing to take on anyone at all from Guantanamo. That is massive hypocrisy. And on the point regarding whether or not the United States should take on Guantanamo detainees, a recent Gallup poll showed that 74% of Americans are opposed to accepting Guantanamo detainees on US soil. This is not a small group of right-wingers. This is the vast majority of the American people, and the vast majority of US senators as well oppose this. So I don't think that realistically this is going to happen.
Andy Worthington, let's go back to this stumbling block, which is the military courts. Do you think that is going to be very difficult for Obama to juggle two views, the one of those who think that military courts are the best option for the United States of America and those who think it's a violation of the Constitution?
Well, you know, bluntly speaking, the Obama administration is being a little bit too cautious and is behaving not as though it wishes to pursue justice, but just that it wants to make sure that none of the prisoners that it regards as significant in any manner are released. It's turned justice on its head. We will have federal court trials if we think that we can get a verdict that we want. If not, then we'll do the military commissions. If we don't think we can even manage the military commissions with their lower burden of proof, then we're just going to imprison these guys without charge or trial indefinitely. That's exactly what the Bush administration's been doing for 7.5 years. So I think that's a disgrace. But I really must just step in to reply to the former speaker and the comments about why prisoners won't be accepted, why it's difficult to find new homes for the prisoners. And it's exactly been demonstrated by what this man has just said. Here we have, I think the latest figures actually are about 65 prisoners who've been approved for release from Guantanamo by the Obama administration. The majority of these prisoners were also approved for transfer by military review boards established under the Bush administration. And yet, here we have your speaker talking about how dangerous the prisoners in Guantanamo still are. This really does not encourage European countries to actually take what the facts are, which is that these guys have been cleared by both the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And I think that's a very important point to make.
Corey Crider, since you've been dealing with many cases, the plan of Obama looks very simple. Release, take others to courts, or put them, hold them indefinitely. Now, what will be the future of the stateless detainees?
I think some other countries are going to have to step up and help Obama if he wants to close Guantanamo Bay. But Obama certainly hasn't been helped by anything like the Pentagon report that the speaker from the Heritage Foundation referred to. This is just an example of the kind of counterproductive activity that's prevented the closure of the prison. They keep ratcheting up the numbers of people who supposedly, quote unquote, return to the battlefield. Then they won't give us half of the names. Then they put out the names, and some of them include people like a high-level person who is allied with the Karzai government, the government that we support. So I think that there's been a lot of misinformation percolate out there. And as for whether these continued procedures, whether continued abuse of prisoners, whether holding people beyond the reach of the law makes us safer or less safe, I'm glad that a couple of people have brought up the fact that a couple of ex-prisoners have appeared on jihad videotapes in Yemen, because you know what else those people say? They say, you should come and join my cause because I was severely abused by the United States in Guantanamo, and that just shows the hypocrisy of the United States. It shows that they're out to target Muslims, and we need to stand up and defend ourselves. Now, if we make ourselves out to be hypocrites, I think that is the clearest evidence you could look for that makes us less safe.
Gardiner, the U.S. is definitely faced with delicate choices when it comes to a final decision about Guantanamo. Let me give you an example. Yemen has almost 93 detainees in Guantanamo. The Americans have been telling the Yemenis to set up a rehabilitation center like the one which the Saudis do have. The Yemenis don't have cash to set up a rehabilitation center. The Americans are telling the Yemenis, we can send them to Saudi Arabia. Yemen is replying back, this is a violation of our sovereignty. What to do with this?
Yeah, I think that there have been major concerns, of course, in the United States over the past few years about releasing prisoners to countries such as Yemen and Saudi Arabia with regard to how they will be treated. And I think this is a broader problem for the United States. One of the reasons why the Uyghurs, for example, were sent by the Bush administration to Bermuda was because they didn't want to send them off to China, where the Chinese government would undoubtedly mistreat them. And this idea that Guantanamo detainees have been abused or tortured, frankly, is complete nonsense. This is a very well-run detention, very well-run detention facility
by independent journalists and groups everywhere in the world, citing very flagrant cases of torture,
such as the International Red Cross have been monitoring Guantanamo for several years, have had complete access, as have hundreds of journalists, lawmakers, not only, of course, from the United States, but across the European Union, Great Britain, for example. And I don't think that you can put together a clear-cut case that detainees have been tortured at Guantanamo.
Oh, well, I can tell you that I've been doing interviews with former detainees from Morocco to Afghanistan who've been talking about cases of waterboarding and torture. Let me go to Mr. Worthington. Now we're talking about the symbolism of a decision to shut down Guantanamo, but still we're bogged down in a very complex reality like this one. Detainees who are deemed to be very dangerous to be released, but also difficult to prosecute in federal courts. Isn't this a grim reminder of the political situation in the United States of America?
Well, it's a sad indictment of the policy that was dreamt up by the Bush administration, that you could have a third category of prisoner. As I said before, if you capture somebody, you hold them because you seize them in wartime as a prisoner of war and you protect them according to the Geneva Conventions, or they're a criminal suspect. The bottom line problem with this is that the Bush administration declared a war on a bunch of criminals who had indulged in a criminal attack, which is what a terrorist attack is. And what we should really be dealing with here is that the administration should have the courage, as I said, if it has any evidence against these men, to put them forward for federal court trials in the United States. The United States courts have a history of successfully prosecuting terrorism suspects. And to be honest, if anyone's worried, the breadth of the abilities of the courts to convince juries of what constitutes terrorism really, shouldn't worry anybody.
Okay, let me go to Corey Crider very briefly. If a decision is to be made in the future about closing Guantanamo, how significant is it going to be?
I think it's extraordinarily significant if the United States ever wants to have any credibility on the world stage ever again. I don't know what planet the commentator who says that people weren't abused in Guantanamo Bay is living on. He needs to go look at the report of Susan Crawford, a Pentagon official who says they tortured a prisoner. They need to look at the Levin report that has massive documentation showing that abuse in Guantanamo was ordered and orchestrated by U.S. officials. Until we close that black spot on U.S. history, we're never going to have any credibility in world affairs ever again.
Well, Niall Gardiner in Washington, D.C., Andy Worthington in London, and Corey Crider in Doha. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.